Hello. I'm Sally, your host. Welcome to my Master's Chess channel, the third board. In this video, I will show you the conclusion of the game played between the 9th world champion, Tigran Petrosian, and the Czechoslovakian Grandmaster, Ludek Pachman, in 1958, Portoroz, Slovenia. If you have not watched part 1, I recommend you watch it first. Just click the link above. If your device does not show the link, you can access part 1 through links my master made available in this video description and in the comments section. So, let's continue the game. As we watched in the last video, in this position, Ludek Pachman had black and played knight to b6, threatening the queen and the rook. What should black do now? According to Stockfish, in this position, there is only one move that would not bring a clear advantage for white. And Petrosian found it. If you wish to try, or study this position, pause the video now. According to Stockfish, knight to d4, blocking the white rook, would be an inferior move. Black would lose the exchange without compensation. The game could continue like this. Knight takes rook. Knight to c5. Queen to d5. Queen to e7. King to b1. Rook takes knight. And white would be better. Let's return to the original position. After knight to b6, another candidate move for black, according to the engine, is knight from d to c5. One possible continuation is rook takes queen. Knight takes queen. Rook takes on e6. If black took the rook with the f-pawn, then the game could continue like this. Knight takes rook. Rook takes knight. Bishop to e2. Bishop to f8. And the position would be better for white. Let's return to the beginning of the variation. After rook takes on e6, black could also play rook from a to d8, refusing the exchange of rooks. The game could continue like this. Rook to e7. Pawn takes knight. Bishop to e2. Playing bishop takes on b6 would be a mistake in this position. Black's response would be bishop to h6 check. King to c2. Rook to d2 check. King to b3. Knight takes on f2. And the position would be equal. Let's return to the variation. After bishop to e2, black could play knight to c5. Bishop to f3. Knight to d3 check. King to c2. But the position would be better for white. Let's return to the original position. After knight to b6, black could also play knight from e to c5. One possible continuation is rook takes queen. Knight takes queen. Rook takes knight. Pawn takes knight. King to b1. But, according to the wise fish, the position would be better for white too. Let's return to the game. There are more candidate moves for black, of course, but that will be enough. Did you find Petrosian's move? In this position, black plays Queen takes on d1 check. No. It is not exactly a queen sacrifice. Black exchanges his queen for a rook and a knight, and regarding material, he will be only a pawn down. But black will have the initiative from now on, and white will have to pay much more attention to his defense. But I think this move was not expected by Pachman, and had a psychological effect. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but after this move, he made a series of inferior moves. The game continues with King takes queen, forced. Pawn takes knight. a3. Defending the pawn. Stockfish prefers queen to b1, retreating the queen. Black continues with knight from d to c5. Queen to c2. Retreating the queen anyway. e4. Freeing the bishop. Black threatens to play knight to a4, and put pressure on the b2 pawn. It was also good to play rook from f to d8 check. White plays f3. This move was a mistake according to Stockfish. It was better for white to play king to e1. Bishop to e2. Or pawn to g3. But in this video, I will show you only two variations. If white had played king to e1, the game could have continued like this. Knight to a4. Bishop to e2. Giving up the queen's knight pawn. Knight takes on b2. Queen to b3. Rook from f to d8. And the position would be slightly better for black. Let's return to the beginning of this variation. After knight to a4, white could also try to defend his pawn by playing b3. In this case, one possible continuation would be knight from a to c5. a4. Knight to d4. Bishop takes knight. Bishop takes bishop. g3. Preparing to develop the bishop by fianchetto. Rook from a to d8. And the position would be better for black. Let's return to the original position. If white had played pawn to g3, it would be better for black to not play knight to a4. If black chose this, one possible line would be bishop to g2, threatening the e4 pawn. f5. King to e2. Bishop takes on b2. c5. Rook from f to d8. And white would recover equality. Let's return to the beginning of this variation. After pawn to g3, instead of knight to a4, it would be better for black to play rook from a to d8 check, and the game could continue like this. King to e1. Knight to d4. Queen to b1. f5. Bishop to g2. Knight to d3 check. And according to the engine, black would be better. Now, let's return to the game. After f3, black continues with rook from a to d8 check. Instead of this move, Master Fish prefers knight to a4 or rook from f to d8. The game continues with king to e1, knight to d4. Black could also have played pawn takes on f3. White continues with bishop takes knight. Bishop takes bishop. Taking the bishop with the rook was better. Pawn takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. It was better to play rook from f to e8 and take the pawn later. And here we come at another interesting position of the game. Look carefully at this board. Even without his big lady, Petrosian has a strong attack. But now, his opponent has, perhaps, his last opportunity to equalize the game. How should white play here? If you wish to study this position, pause the video now. In this position, the best move for white is queen takes knight, giving back to Petrosian his own medicine. One possible continuation would be rook from f to e8. Queen takes rook check. Rook takes queen check. King to d2. Bishop takes on b2. And the position would be only slightly better for black according to Stockfish. Let's return to the game. Unfortunately, in the actual game, Pachman chose another path. The game continues with bishop to e2. Rook from f to e8. Observe how Petrosian's army dominates the board. Rook to f1. Rook to e7. Preparing to double rooks. Rook to f3. Threatening to play rook to d3, pinning the bishop. Rook from d to e8. Rook to d3. This was an inferior move. According to Master Fish, it was better for white to play king to f1, retreating the king and preventing bishop to g1. Or advance the g-pawn to g3 or g4. Nevertheless, Pachman is now threatening the black bishop. Where should the priest go? Petrosian plays bishop to g1, threatening the h2 pawn. This was also black's best move according to the engine. The game continues with h3. This was another weak move. Stockfish suggests rook to f3, or bishop to f3, instead. In both cases, giving up the h2 pawn. Black continues with Bishop to h2. Planning to move the bishop to g3. However, now that the rook file pawn has moved, it was better to play bishop to f2 check. The game could have continued this way. King to f1. Knight to g3 check. King takes bishop. Rook takes bishop. Queen takes rook. Knight takes queen. And black would be better. Let's return to the beginning of the variation. After bishop to f2 check, the white king could also retreat to d1. After that, knight to g3. Rook takes on g3. Bishop takes rook. Bishop to f3. Rook to e1 check. King to d2. Bishop to f4 check. And black would be much better. Let's return to the beginning of this sub-variation. After knight to g3, instead of taking the knight with the rook, white could play bishop to f3, but the position would be even worse, because of rook to e1 check. King to d2. Rook from e8, to e2 check. King to c3. If instead, white played bishop takes rook, then black would play knight to e4 mate. After king to c3, the variation continues. Knight to e4 check. Bishop takes knight. Rook takes queen. King takes rook. Rook takes bishop. And black's advantage would be overwhelming. Now, let's return to the original position. After bishop to h2, the game continues with bishop to f3. Bishop to g3 check. King to d1. Knight to f2 check. King to d2. Bishop to f4 check. King to c3. Knight takes on d3. King takes on d3. Rook to e3 check. King to d4. Bishop to h6. It was also good to play bishop to d6. White continues with pawn to c5. Pawn to b5. It was better to play bishop to g7 check. If instead of pawn to b5, black played pawn takes pawn, one possible continuation would be king to c4. Of course, the pawn cannot be taken now because of rook to c8, winning. Pawn to b5 check. King takes on b5. Rook to b8 check. King to a5. And black would still be much better. Let's return to the game. After pawn to b5, white plays bishop takes on b7. This was another mistake. According to the engine, pawn to c6 was better. In that case, we could have pawn takes pawn. King to c5. Rook from e3, to e5 check. King to b4. Bishop to f8 check. but black's position would still be much better. Let's return to original position. After bishop takes on b7, the game is pretty much lost. Black continues with bishop to g7 check. King to d5, forced. Petrosian plays rook from e8, to e6. Threatening rook from e3, to e5 check, and after the king moves, a discovered check, winning the queen. However, the wise fish considers that an inferior move, and instead of rook to e6, suggests another line. I was planning to show you that variation, but my master told me it was not necessary. So, I shall not take your patience for granted, and make you even more tired. Because in this position, Ludek Pachman resigned. Did you like this game? I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want notifications of more chess games, please subscribe to this channel. That would help us make more content like this. We wish you success in your chess. Thank you, and see you again.